Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Today we're going to be talking about talent development practices with Matthew Layton. Matt, welcome.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks for inviting me on.
Super excited to be unpacking a paper you've done recently about talent development pathways, measurement, tracking and development practices within English professional football. It's a really, really gripping paper, so super excited to be talking with you about that paper. Let's start, though, where we always start, Matt. Tell us a little bit about yourself and tell us about your work.
Sure. Firstly, Dan, thanks for inviting me on. Hopefully, I can share some research upon this paper and some potential experiences that will help people within academy football and within English academy setups, and also across the talent development pathway. In terms of my own experiences, a very modest and somewhat average football career, as a lot of people would probably quote, and across sports as well. So within football and across cricket and a number of other sports. And as you start to go through your own education system, is you start to work out actually what you kind of want to do and what you potentially are good at and can potentially add value for a future career. And I got into coaching, into football coaching and into sports coaching from a very young age, whilst I was at early stages of college. Ultimately, my kind of fledgling playing career fizzled out a little bit, as it does, and you make the decision to go into coaching. Undertook a sports management degree at the University of Birmingham, and then once I completed that, gained a position within academy football, part-time within academy football, and alongside developing and creating a sports coaching company, which I ran for a number of years. Developing that into a registered charity arm as well, which delivered a lot of community-based, social inclusion-based sporting and football activities, from grassroots level to inclusion to lots of governing body programs that were funded at national level as well across a number of local regions, which gave me a real broad insight into working with people, young adults, adults at risk, young people at risk as well as elite footballers as well. And it gave me a broad understanding of coaching practice, as well as managing people, staff, coaches, administrators, as well as people within sport as well. Did that for a number of years, and then kind of found myself enjoying the elite side of football coaching. And then the opportunity arose where I moved to West Bromwich Albion full-time, where I had a joint role as a youth development coach and football operations manager. And that was at the very beginning of the EPPP process in 2011. And it was a new programme, as everybody will know, and it was an explosion of practices, processes, requirements, and grass time and practice time with the players, which was a key critical component of the EPPP when it was brought into force.
Matt, what does EPPP stand for?
Sure, it's a Premier League programme that was introduced in 2011, and it's the Elite Player Performance Plan, ultimately to provide young players within elite football clubs across the board opportunity to excel and develop their practice, to raise the standards, as the Premier League will suggest, to raise the standards of coaching practice and processes within elite youth development. That programme now has run a really good course in terms of its review process, and it's one that has had real good success. And going back to myself as to how my career sort of developed through there, is it was a really new program for everybody in terms of the staff and what requirements were put in place on coaches in terms of how they operated, in terms of qualifications, in terms of coach development, and expectations as well, because the Premier League put a lot of funding into the program, and it has been successful. So that gave me a real on-the-ground insight across multidisciplinary departments, so across education, across sports psychology across nutrition, performance, recruitment, talent ID, and it gave me a real kind of grounding and understanding as to how those departments work, how they have worked, and how they can work, and have evolved over time under the program of the Elite Player Performance program. Alongside that, Dan, I continued my coaching on the grass coaching across the player pathway. So predominantly from age 12 through to 16, where I got the opportunity to work with some really talented players every day, and some really good people and some really good coaches and multidisciplinary staff that have helped me develop and help me improve my practice both on the pitch and off the pitch to help support the players. And I gained a lot of knowledge over that time. Part of that process, you then go through the additional coaching qualifications to extend your knowledge and experience through the FA, predominantly through the Advanced Youth Awards, through UEFA programs as well, and through Premier League programs. So I was fortunate to do the elite coaches apprenticeship program with the Premier League, which really opened my eyes to my behaviours, how I operated as a practitioner and as a coach, and extending my knowledge around potentially the psychosocial development as well, which is something we'll unpack a little bit later. And I think those experiences and the people that I got to meet and the mentors that I got to work with have really helped develop my own knowledge as a practitioner and as a coach as well. That from that point, I moved from West Bromwich Albion after about 11 years and moved to Swansea City, where I'm at the moment. And I'm the head of youth phase at Swansea City, where my role is to predominantly manage the staff, multidisciplinary staff department, and the players within the youth development phase to support and coordinate their pathway throughout the programme into the professional development phase, which is from 17 years upwards.
Well, Matt, that sounds like a seriously holistic education pathway that you've been involved with the last decade or so. That EPPP, the Elite Player Performance Program, really interesting. I mean, I was working in academy football back in 2011, and I remember when this was introduced and strive to produce the documentation that the Premier League required. And to speak to your point, my understanding is a lot of the success that the England teams across men's and women's are experiencing right now. Part of this is being attributed, this success is being attributed to the fantastic holistic education that coaches now give young players that has been stipulated by the EPPP. Would that be a fair comment to make?
Very fair. I think there's much more of a perception from coaches and practitioners within academies as to the holistic development of players, predominantly through the EPPP, as we mentioned, and also through the coach education programs that are in place.
Yeah.
There was a perception at the beginning of the EPPP that the English players weren't technically as good and as well-rounded as potentially our European counterparts, which there's no doubt they potentially were, but the practice time and the evolution of how those players practice and the quality in which and the systems that they're in place has definitely been upskilled and has definitely progressed. And there's no doubt, as you mentioned, Dan, there's no doubt that the success of the national teams, especially at junior level as well, over the last sort of 5 or 6 years, you would say, has definitely been a byproduct of the good work that's going on within academy youth development practices at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating stuff, and I think the EPPP has really lent itself towards building the meta skills of coaches as well, not just providing a holistic education. But I think you've mentioned this as you spoke about your biography, that the EPPP allows coaches to build their self-awareness, their self-reflection skills on a day-by-day basis, Matt.
Definitely, and those were practices and processes in place that weren't actually there before the EPPP was integrated. I think I would 100% agree the fact that coaches are definitely more self-aware as to how they operate. The requirements on them are higher. The expectations on them are higher, often mandated by the Premier League and by the Football League in terms of expectations, but also the holistic and educational programs, as well as the in-club and in-academy support that coaches get now to develop, definitely of upskilled coaches across psychosocial development, across technical and tactical development as well. And there's no doubt that education and that upskilling of coach support is reflected within the quality of players that academies are producing.
And it means that passionate coaches like yourself, Matt, are now keener to find a pathway to research coaching as well as apply any research that's out there at the coalface. And I know you're on a pathway to complete a PhD. And today we're here to talk about one of the papers that's involved in your PhD. And that paper is entitled The Measurement, Tracking and Development Practices of English Professional Football Academies. Tell us a little bit about the genesis of this paper, Matt. Start us from the beginning.
Sure. Now, just before we start, I think hopefully the information that we'll provide and some of the research will be relative to people that are working within academies football. But I think there's a lot of scope for your listeners to apply their own context and certainly apply their own context around psychosocial development and how some of the areas that we'll touch upon could potentially be reflected upon and could potentially be operationalised within their own environments as well. Certainly, the genesis of where I've certainly come from is very a practical based background. So we wanted to look at something that was day to day practical for me and my research, and an area that we could add value to how I was practicing on a day to day basis. The paper itself looks to identify talent development policies and systems in place within English football academies, and we predominantly looked at three areas that we wanted to touch upon. Firstly, to understand what factors academies believe to be important in the development of their players across 15 participants, so across 15 different talent development environments within English academy football. Secondly, to explore what academies are tracking and how they measure the performance and development of their youth players. And then thirdly is to analyse the extent as to which these factors are integrated within their player curricula. Now, I just want to define what we mean and how we've defined player curricula, just so we're clear, is the experiences that we want the player to have. Now, that can be underpinned and developed through individual development plans, which every club within the EPPP system will have for their players. So an individualised plan, often built on areas of strength, improving those areas of strength, and often based on developing and improving areas of weakness or potential barriers to help improve the player. Now, those individual development plans, how that we link that to the curriculum, is the means in which that we as academy practitioners and clubs want to shape that curriculum. Now, that will be a slightly different definition to a syllabus, which may well be a mandated, systematic process of themes and actions, and a kind of one size fits all approach to development. Now, the player curricula, with the player being at the centre of that curricula, is then how clubs, and to the extent in which clubs from a holistic perspective, how they integrate their practices and their systems to measure and track the development of their players holistically through the means of, for example, individual development plans or the player curricula.
And it's a bit remiss of me not to mention your co-authors on this paper, Dr. Jamie Taylor, who's a regular guest on the Sports Psych Show, and Professor Dave Collins, whose papers have contributed to numerous discussions on the Sports Psych Show. Two of your supervisors?
Yes, certainly. And they have provided me with some fantastic support and some fantastic knowledgeable support to help me with this paper and within my own personal development as well. So they've provided a real insight to support the development of this paper and future work as well.
This paper is striving to understand what factors are important in talent development pathways, what are academies tracking and measuring, and how are these factors integrated into the curriculum and syllabus. And something interesting you said there, you differentiated between a syllabus and a curriculum. And let me check my understanding, if I heard you correctly. A syllabus could be considered something as a more generic contribution to player education, whereas a curriculum might be considered more from an individual player perspective. Would I be hearing you correctly there?
Yeah, that's how we would define it. So,
Okay.
in a practical sense, and the paper unpicks certainly at younger phases. So within the foundation phase, which within English Youth Academies is predominantly from 9 years old, from entry into the youth development, the youth pathway, up to the age of 12. Now, predominantly there will be a higher focus on systematic, one-size-fits-all criteria and syllabus. So, for example, the player will be coached upon and practice a specific skill, a specific technical skill. So, for example, receiving the ball might be one, or it might be passing or attacking 1v1 or defending 1v1. And often those systems in place in terms of a syllabus, especially at the younger age groups, are highly emphasised, highly weighted, but will provide academies with a kind of checklist and a criteria to say, but by the end of the foundation phase of development, all of our players have experienced and practiced what we believe to be the core technical skills that we feel as being important for the development of our players. So as they start to progress through the youth development phase, so predominantly from 12 or 13 upwards, we can bank upon that the player has spent a sufficient amount of time practicing what we believe to be the core technical skills.
Really interesting. Now, a lot of people listening in might be thinking, well, what's all this got to do with sports psychology? This is coaching science. And as always, I say in these situations that I take a broad definition of sports psychology, and I also think sports psychology lends itself to each of the different areas of sports science and coaching science and skill acquisition. So I think sports psychology is heavily nested into any curriculum, any syllabus, and every part of a talent development pathway. It's always involved. And of course, we're going to be, as you mentioned, Matt, we're going to be honing in on some psychosocial aspects of talent development pathways and what you've uncovered in your research. But I would always say that biopsychosocial, or sports psychology, if you'd prefer to use that term, is constantly happening, and coaches need to constantly consider this area within the talent development pathway. Tell me a little bit about how you conducted this. So there was 3 research questions you were essentially inquiring about. You were looking to understand more on. Tell me a little bit about how you conducted this research.
Sure. So the criteria for the 15 participants that we interviewed was that they had over 10 years experience across the full youth development pathway, with a track record of creating and developing academy policy. So, for example, experienced practitioners who have been involved for above that period of time or are currently active within the system and have a strong track record of working with and producing players who have gone on to become professional footballers at the highest level,
Okay.
and have a good range of experiences across the youth development pathway, from entry at under nines through to full senior and professional phases as well. Often those would have been academy managers, academy directors, heads of youth development, heads of technical heads of development, heads of education and talent ID, heads of coaching, and youth coach educators at national level as well. So that was our criteria as to who we wanted to interview. And we went through some semi-structured interviews and worked on the basis of the reflexive thematic analysis to code and theme the key points around our three objectives. And the results were interesting, it's fair to say, and varied to an extent, Dan. But there were some common themes that were very evident across the board. Those common themes were that actually several factors were perceived to be important in the long-term development of their players. Now that's clearly obvious. We knew that would potentially be the case before, but what we wanted to explore was to actually how and what the weighting of importance was for different clubs, different practitioners, and then how they then utilise that weighting of importance to operationalise what they do and how they integrate it to support their players. Now, it was evident that every club subscribes to them all. So the four corner model that the FA produced through the Premier League, through the EPPP, so split into four corners essentially. So technical, tactical, psychological, and physical. Now, all academies prescribe to them all, but all have a different weighting as to different stages of development. Now, there was a perception throughout the process that the physical corner was often overutilised. Now, that could be for a variety of reasons. It could be that those measures are objectively measured, which is the case, and that's a process that's mandated by the Premier League to mandate the physical fitness testing of youth players from entry into the academy system 3 times a year from the age of 9 upwards. Now, those physical tests are systematic, they are mandated, and they are adult-themed physical fitness tests that are implemented by academies, by practitioners, all the way through the process. There was a perception around an all-round technical and tactical skills to achieve sustained high-level success, which, again, may well seem obvious, but there was definitely a differentiation as to when those were implemented and when those were overemphasised. And as I mentioned earlier, the technical attributes were certainly emphasised at the younger age groups predominantly, with the tactical emphasis kind of drip feeding in as you get a little bit older and we move towards more adult size games, so 11-a-side football at age 13 and upwards. There was an understanding that tactical adaptability was important, especially when transitioning into new environments. So from small-sided football to 11-a-sided football, for example, at age 13, or from youth football into senior environments. So, for example, from 16 on into 17 as well. But the real important factor that was highlighted throughout was the importance of developing psychological skills, and they were promoted as being critical throughout the process, potentially underpinning the acceleration of other potentially important factors. So how psychological skills and the development of well-rounded psychological skills throughout the pathway can help improve a player's decision-making or game awareness or ability to attack 1v1 or defend 1v1, for example. However, those developments of psychological skills tended to be emphasised and weighted in importance as players moved towards the older end of the youth development pathway, and was not as seen as important at the younger stages. So an area that we concluded from that was that if coaches and practitioners are highlighting the importance of developing psychological skills as a discriminatory factor is how academies can and should potentially be providing more of an emphasis at younger age groups from an individual player curricular point of view. Now, it was evident through our research that academies do implement a psychological framework for development, often through a one-size-fits-all approach and often linked to technical outcomes or tactical outcomes, for example. So on the ground example there would be developing bravery or resilience in a 1v1 situation to receive the ball, for example. Now, those areas are evident, but they're often age-related. So at under 9s, we're going to do this. At under 10s, we're going to do this, etc., etc. Whereas we would promote from this research is the development of well-rounded psychological characteristics on an individual basis, implemented and operationalised through the development of individual development plans.
Really interesting. And I want to reflect back what I've heard, and you can fill in any missing gaps here because I haven't been able to write everything down. But just before I do, I just want to check my own understanding around the FA four-corner model, which is obviously distributed through the EPPP, so from the Premier League. My understanding is it's tech-tack in one corner, physical in another, psych in another, social in another, or is it done a little bit differently through the EPPP?
It is seen slightly differently.
Okay, brilliant.
As you mentioned, with those four corners there, with technical and tactical being placed into one.
You're right.
However, there is a slight misinterpretation as to how some academies implement that. Some will pin technical and tactical into separate boxes, and some will pin psychological and social into the same box. So our experience would say that, yes, you are correct as to how the FA deliver it and how they put it across, I should say. But clubs interpret it slightly differently across those four areas. But they're often the key thing is seen in silos, seen in separate corners, with a split of technical, tactical in one, psychological, social merged in another, but sometimes separated dependent on each club's wants and needs.
So in terms of coherence across the academy, they allow for a little bit of what might be described as slippage.
Yes.
Gotcha. It's a bit of variance. Okay, well that's fair enough. And what I heard you say, I mean, you've got some pretty experienced coaches contributing to this that you're interviewing, and what I heard you say, and I'll go through this in a broad brush way. The physical contribution is pretty consistent throughout, mandated down from the Premier League. That technical tends to be the emphasis with the early age groups, tactical emerging as throughout the age groups as they get older. The psychological scene is interesting in as much as everybody agrees that the psychological side, in essence, and I suppose I'll use my term here, underpins all of the other components, yet it's done a little bit more thoroughly. It's delivered a little bit more comprehensively at older age groups within talent development pathways. At younger age groups, it is present, but it tends to be a bit more implicit and aligned with the technical side. For example, a 9 or a 10-year-old being brave to show for the ball, and what you are suggesting within your research is, hey, hang on a minute here. We need to make this a little bit broader, a little bit more psychosocial, and delivered in as individual a manner as possible.
Sure, and I would definitely agree with your summary there, Dan, and the importance of how the four factors, the four corner model factors, and how they integrate and support the player's development. Now, important as to how they integrate, how they're operationalised, and importantly, how coaches
What do you mean? What do you mean by operation?
So operationalise is what we mean is how that is then implemented at ground level across the
Right.
multidisciplinary team. So
Great.
on the pitch, off the pitch support, feedback, coach to player feedback, peer to peer feedback, how the coach or the multidisciplinary team action what they need to action.
What it's like at the coalface.
Absolutely.
Good.
So as well, Dan, is how it's operationalised, but also is how coaches and the academies and the clubs in whole are measuring and tracking how their players are developing within those factors as well. So in essence, as you mentioned earlier, is the physical corner is objectively measured. It's a numbers based. It's a fact and the figure. However, isn't always accounting for maturation and growth and maturation changes as a youth player develops throughout the system, and often used as a benchmarking comparison, which may well be considered unrealistic and unfair in which to compare two youth players, for example. But the technical, tactical, and certainly the psychological corners seemed across the academy system seem to be very much weighted towards subjective measuring. Now, that's not to say that subjective measuring is a bad thing, but what we would advise and what we would suggest from the research in this paper is that the academies need to gain a clarity between their multidisciplinary teams as to what they mean by their measurements and their grading. But then importantly is then how they can coherently integrate that into their curriculum and accurately measure how their player is progressing in terms of their development. And I say development and not performance, how they are developing in relation to their long-term needs. So from a top-down perspective, what are they aiming to achieve? And then how we can then measure and coherently track the players' development as they move through the layers of development into senior environments.
So as you're speaking, it's making me think of the importance of definitions. What do we want to see? What do we want to develop? What does that development look like? What does improvement look like? So in essence, what you're asking coaches within talent development pathways to do is to make sense of their talent development pathway, to make sense of what they want, and to be able to make sense in order to engage in judgment and decision making, or professional judgment and decision making within one's own coaching practice, and also to be able to measure as objectively as possible. Let's take the physical side away because that's the one piece that is much easier, I think we all accept, to measure objectively. But the tech tac and obviously the psychosocial piece, to measure these as objectively as possible. But that measurement, the capacity to measure, is heavily based on us defining what we're looking for and then operationalizing that improvement process.
Absolutely. Now, there are a number of research studies and a number of frameworks that have been implemented in the past to, for example, measure technical characteristics. However, what we would promote is providing context to that and providing a rational understanding as to what that means from a technical perspective, but also within the context of gameplay. Now, I can probably define into 6 areas, Dan, to probably allude to what you just said, is when academies are looking to design their player curriculum. So firstly, what are we actually looking for? And defining those areas. What, from the top down, are the needs of our football club? So what are the needs of our football club at the top, at whatever environment or level that football club is? And then critically, from a developmental perspective, is academy practitioners and clubs differentiating and defining between performance factors and what we would call hygiene factors or maintenance factors. So what are the most critical, important things to aid the player's performance and development that we need to identify and work upon on an individual basis? Then we can start to weight our importance at each stage of that individual player's development. But critically, that changes over time. As we all know, the player will develop and accelerate and plateau over the course of their development. But having a clear understanding as to what those performance factors are for that individual based on the most important factors, so that may well be a psychosocial development skills in particular, or it might be a specific technical skill, or it might be a specific tactical skill we would promote. But keeping an eye on the other things to make sure that they're ticking along nicely, to make sure that we're good enough at the physical component, that we're adequate enough, that we can cope with the demands of the game, but really highlighting and focusing on the performance factors. Now, to operationalise what's really important, we would promote from our research is for all the stakeholders within the academy to understand what we're looking to achieve, but then how do we then achieve that with that particular player, and how do we coordinate the pathway and the challenges and to coordinate the experience of the player to facilitate them getting better at the critical things that may well differentiate between them making it as professional footballers at our football club or not. And then we would begin to promote integration, as I mentioned earlier, and also the level of coherence up from the top down, so from the under-16s coach to the under-18s coach to the academy manager, and then across the levels that's reinforced through player profiling that's coherent with the sports scientists, with the sports psych, with the education department, and then externally is the shared coherent message from parents, from other stakeholders, so even from agents within academy football, for example, to ensure that we are promoting and coherently working on the most important factors for that player's development. Now, as we mentioned earlier, is the importance of psychosocial development underpinning the other areas of development is a critical factor, and we would certainly promote and highlight that academies show a real weighting of importance to developing those individual characteristics through frameworks such as the psychological characteristics developing excellence, the PCDEs as a promoted framework as well, may well be a really good framework from which to develop those critical psychological skills that underpin the other areas of the important performance factors.
Before we move on to any psychosocial stuff, just listening to what you're saying and grounding this in a bit of psychology, it being the sports psych show, what I was hearing you say, your 6 steps there, very much promotes the notion of a shared mental model, where we have some coherence horizontally, vertically across our talent and development pathway, and so subsequently that shared mental model, whether it's key stakeholders within the coaching staff, the players themselves, the parents of players, we can start to have better, more informed, more accurate conversations amongst ourselves in order to promote professional judgment, decision making. Would that be fair? This notion of a shared mental model.
Absolutely, and a shared mental model to track and measure coherently the most important factors, which are often subjectively measured on the whole. Now, developing a shared mental model within academy systems is evident, and it's certainly become more evident over recent years and times as the development of coaching teams and the knowledge of practitioners and their holistic development has certainly accelerated, and that comes through the development of academy manager programs and leadership programs, etc. Now, to operationalise in academy football, the development of shared mental models, certainly from this perspective, we would define as facilitating the player's pathway and coherently facilitating the player's pathway. So, for example, as you mentioned, Dan, is regular discussion-based workshops, continual professional development workshops, internal training, for example, to evolve greater coherence and understanding around those key performance factors. And that may well be a technical attribute, it might well be a tactical attribute. Now, as an example of that might be two coaches working within the same age group may have a different interpretation as to what a good example of decision making may well be for a 13-year-old player. Now, what's important from a club perspective and an academy perspective is that we bring together that understanding to develop a shared mental model of what those grading systems, marking systems, whatever the academy has in place, to ensure that, for example, I'm not perceiving a 5 out of 5 and my partner coach is now not perceiving a 2 out of 5. That then creates problems with the development, the progression, and ultimately the measuring and tracking of that player's progress. Now, that can be across, as I mentioned, as an example there, from a tactical perspective, but certainly from a psychosocial development, is getting a really good understanding as to what that bravery looks like that you mentioned earlier, what that resilience, that grit looks like, but also critically what it looks like for that particular player, because as we all know, it looks different and it's perceived differently through actions and behaviours of the player. But by upskilling and gaining that level of coherence from regular discussions, conferences, continued professional development programs, it will support, in essence, the coaching team's ability to rationalise and project the needs of their players over time. That can then, which comes back to the building of a coherent player curricula, can then be effectively integrated into the player's curricula. Now, might be through the means of coaching practice or coach design or session design, for example, but can certainly be through coherent player feedback, for example. For example, me as an under-12s coach is giving a coherent message on effective development of the player's decision-making, which is then reinforced at some other point throughout the multidisciplinary team. So is that reinforced by the sports psychologist, but also reinforced from a psychosocial perspective through the performance coach? So they're reinforcing that mentality or that resilience or the specific psychosocial skill, but it may well be in the gym setting, for example. But there's a real coherence as to the method, the terminology, the knowledge, and the clarity as to what that looks like at each stage of that individual player's development, and then how that's then fed back in a coherent manner to that particular player.
Interesting. So what I'm thinking there is, by having that shared mental model, by having coherence, vertical and horizontal, it enables us to have better conversations across coaching staff and variety of coaching staff. And so subsequently, there are more touch points with players with relation to the important development messages. So as you've said, if a young player is struggling to be brave to get on the ball, well, a coach might say that, tell them that, give them opportunities within activities to practice that. But if that same message, if there are frequent touch points there, if that same message is reinforced by the sports psychologist, if a talent development pathway is lucky enough to have a sports psychologist involved, or even the strength and conditioning coach or other coaches that might be involved with that young player now or in the future, that shared mental model increases the possibility for important touch points that reinforces messages that might change behaviour.
Certainly, and I think, look at it from an adult perspective, is we all crave feedback.
Yes.
And certainly young players crave feedback. And I think if young players know that the coach or the coaches or the team really invest and care in their development, the level and the quality of that feedback can be really, really valuable, and can extend and develop the players' psychosocial skills that underpin the other areas, as we mentioned earlier. And I think what's important, and we touched on this through the development of facilitating and discussion-based workshops, is we're all sports psychologists. We all identify, and through the research in this paper, we identify that it's a really important factor. But do we integrate enough across the multidisciplinary team? Do we all consider the importance that we all have to develop those underpinning psychosocial skills, that the performance coach can reinforce a psychosocial message, or it's not just down to the sports psychologist, let's say, to do it in a classroom-based workshop? It's actually a constant, reflective, 24-hour-a-day development that the coach and the multidisciplinary team can coherently share and advise and guide the player upon. And I think that also extends to outside of the academy building as well, the importance that parents play within the players' development. And I think certainly from a psychosocial development perspective is developing shared mental models around external stakeholders within academy football as well. And that is a practice that, through the research of this paper, is one that is being certainly implemented across the country. Certainly is upskilling and developing the psychosocial development and knowledge of parents and stakeholders involved within the players' development away from the academy, and how they can coherently reinforce the message of the coaching team, and how they can help support the player feedback process. And that then becomes a triangular coach, player, parent model that can 24 hours a day essentially reinforce the message that a coach is trying to deliver to support. Now, that's difficult to manage in some talent development environments, certainly. But I think with the right development program and the right education program for parents, especially, I think that's potentially an area where academies can accelerate the development of psychosocial skills to support and underpin the other areas of development, as we mentioned.
I agree, and I think it's a fascinating landscape. And one of the messages I'm constantly delivering, and I respectfully don't want to contradict what you've said, but I try to pinpoint the message around, look, coaches and parents, I'll include parents in this, coaches do psychology. They're not sports psychologists per se, and I don't think anyone, including yourself, you want to be a sports psychologist per se, but you do psychology in your role every single second of every single day. And this kind of research helps you become a better deliverer of the psychosocial or the psychological side of things. I think that's absolutely imperative. And dwelling on that for a few moments. I mean, you've mentioned approaches to incorporating the psychosocial, the psychological side into talent development pathways. And there are approaches out there. You've mentioned one, which we've talked about quite a few times on the Sports Psych Show, which is the PCDEs, or the psychological characteristics of developing excellence. I want to be respectful to others and say there's others out there, such as Chris Harwood, who's recently been on the Sports Psych Show with his 5 C's framework, which focuses on commitment and communication, concentration, control, and confidence. There's Learner's 6 C's around competence, character, connection, confidence, caring, and contributions. I also think of the work of Jean Coté, and I also think of the great work of back in the 90s of Graham Jones and Lou Hardy, working on mental skills training, their psychological skills and psychological techniques. So there's numerous approaches out there that talent development pathways can utilize. I'm keen to get your experience of this. How do you go about this, in your own coaching practice, and the measurement as well, because you've mentioned measurement, and this paper is about measurement. So often we talk about psychological or psychosocial skills being tough to measure. How do you go about delivering? Any stories to share? Any thoughts on this, and from the measurement perspective as well?
Sure. I think firstly it comes down to accurate profiling of where the player is, and that comes back to the shared mental model approach as to the me and the rest of the coaching team and the rest of the wider coaching team understand as to where the player is and potentially where their long-term needs and long-term goals may well be. And that can then support the design of how we work with that particular player across all the factors, and specifically from a psychosocial perspective. I think from my experience, Dan, of working within youth development football for a little while, is still the perception of he can physically cope, so let's throw him some more challenges. Now, an obvious and probably maybe a lazy example is the player's physically mature, so let's play him in the next age group up to challenge those physical attributes.
Mm.
Now, that's fine because, okay, that may well be for a specific need and want, and that's okay. But what we would suggest here is a more holistic, integrated approach to actually what does that player need at that particular time across the factors. And that links back to my own experiences as well, is that player working on what they need to work on as a performance factor. So if we are saying that the physical characteristics and the physical development are a kind of maintenance factor, let's keep an eye on, and maybe not a key discriminator as we move throughout the pathway, should we be focusing upon, are we playing that player in the age group above for the right reasons? So have we considered his psychosocial development? Have we considered the fact that, yes, from a physical maturation point of view, he may well be ahead of his peers, but psychosocially, is that group ahead, or is that environment, or is that challenge in terms of what he's going into? So it may well be a cut game, for example, a high pressurized scenario or situation. Is that the right environment at the right time for that player, or is it outside of his psychosocial bandwidth at this particular time? And can we as coaching staff provide the necessary psychosocial support that it becomes a developmental factor and not a detrimental factor? Have we considered that when that player plays in the age group above, have we considered his technical capacity? On the flip side of that is, let's say, an undermaturated player. Do we hold that player back from developing those performance factors, so resilience, grit, etc., or technical capacity to receive the ball in tight areas? Have we thought about, well, actually, no, we will play that player up an age group. We will play that player up in two age groups. We will play them in that cup final to challenge those particular skills. Are we as practitioners and as coaches, are we brave enough ourselves from a developmental perspective to challenge that player in that scenario to help accelerate the performance factors of that particular player? Or do we hold back a little bit? And that may well result into performance versus development, or results versus development, which has been touched on before in your show. Are we brave enough as coaches, and is the environment within the academy supportive enough to go, no, that player may well be undermaturated, but we're going to play the player in this particular game, in this particular environment, or he's going to train with this particular group because we can accelerate his performance factors. We can accelerate his grit or his determination or his decision-making skills, because those may well be the factors through this paper that we've highlighted. They may well be the factors that may discriminate at a later date to help to discriminate, the difference between the player making it or not making it at this football club. So if our football club has a real high emphasis on technical development and skill development, for example, let's accelerate the development of that player based on that factor, and let's expand the player's bandwidth and skill set at the right time.
It's really interesting, Matt, and thanks so much for this. My mind is awash with different things here. Everything you said there made me reflect on the importance of understanding the factors that are important to you within your specific talent development pathway. It's making me think of the importance of once you know what is important. Well, what does this look like at the coalface? How are we, as you say, operationalizing this? How are we integrating these factors together? How are we measuring these factors as players are developing through the pathway? And all of that lends itself to what you've just said there. And I know you were talking about the psychosocial side of things, but ultimately it comes back to better conversation between key stakeholders, doesn't it? So that you can make the optimal decisions that are going to eventually impact how far a player goes. It kind of feels like that classic control the controllables. Even what can we control? Well, we can do these things, and that can really positively impact how good this player becomes in the future. But we've got to be organized. We've got to have these shared mental models. We've got to have these better conversations. We've got to answer these questions as accurately as we can, and then so subsequently we can have as positive an impact on the experience and development of our players. That's what it's making me think of.
Absolutely. And I think the research from this paper has also interestingly identified that clubs are often their weighting of importance and often then how they operationalise and measure, and certainly from a talent ID perspective, how they profile players is often dictated by their demographics and the demographics of their local area and the demographics of the players that they often recruit into the academy, which may well provide a slightly different weighting of importance from a talent ID perspective, but certainly from a coaching perspective as well. So we would certainly promote that in your environment, in your club, as you mentioned earlier, Dan, is what are the needs of our football club? That is critical. There's got to be an alignment and an understanding as to what are the key skills, what are the key performance indicators for our players to achieve at our football club. Now, to throw into the mix of there as well from my own experiences is we all know that not every player is going to play for our first team. That's obvious. We all know that. Or not every player is going to become a professional or an elite athlete in that particular sport. Now, within the English pyramid and football structure is then we have a duty of care as coaches as to how can we help facilitate this player to gain a career, or from a club perspective, how can our asset as an asset of as a young player, how can we sell them, if you like, to another football club at a different level of the pyramid, and what slightly different skills might they need within, in this example, within the English pyramid football structure, and how they may differentiate from the highest level at the top end of the Premier League. Now, there's a lot of common ground and there's a lot of common performance factors, as we know, but there are some slightly different emphasis, and certainly maybe more of a weighting towards the physical side of the game, and certainly different types of specific technical skills. For example, and an example I might use is defending direct play, so heading the ball and defending against players that run in behind, and players that maybe more direct play, which you may well see a little bit lower down the pyramid as to what you may see in the Premier League, as a generalised statement. So as that player got the ability to cover bigger distances, but have they got the performance factors to be in the right position at the right time, to have the correct body shape, to make the correct decision on the timing of tackle, for example? Now that slightly differentiates from a player that might not get in our first team, but the key performance factors are still there. But then how can we slightly align them? And that comes back to a shared mental model, that we're all clear on what that player's pathway and ultimate outcome may well be based on our professional judgment. But then what are we then doing to help support that player to maybe just tinker with their skills slightly? And that lends back to the psychosocial development, to earn a career somewhere else. And the club will always say to earn money for the football club by selling on to someone else.
Brilliant. Fantastic. Matt, I can't thank you enough for this. I mean, absolutely fascinating paper. And to reinforce what you said at the beginning, this is relevant for talent development pathways across all sports. We're talking football, soccer, but absolutely relevant across all sports. Matt, how can people find you, follow you, get in touch, and potentially read this paper?
Sure. So, first port of call is my email address. So it would be Matthew Layton at swansea-city.com. I am on Twitter, and it's Matt_Layton5. Please feel free to get in touch, and I can help where I possibly can, or share some more information to help support your listeners as well. But no, thanks for having me on, Dan. Hopefully it's been of use, and happy and delighted to share some of our findings with you.
And just before I let you go, just that paper.
Yeah, sure. It's on Journal of Sports Sciences, and it's open access as well, and that can be searched. And I'm on LinkedIn as well, so I will pop that out as well. Yeah, more than happy. Get in touch, and I'm happy to share it with you and provide you with the correct links.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Matt.
Thanks, Dan.
Well, everyone, I really enjoyed that podcast, and I'd love to hear what you, the listener, thinks. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook, or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the Sports Light Show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.